Welcome to the Stories Told podcast. This is episode 37, a hauntingly delightful interview. This is the Stories Told podcast. Two authors talking about stories in movies, TV, and of course, books.
I'm Michael Grayford. I write action-adventure stories in fantasy and sci-fi worlds, sometimes for younger readers and sometimes for adults. And I try to always inject at least a little bit of humor.
And I am author E.W. Barnes, and I write action-adventure, time travel novels, and space opera science fiction. Thousands of years, thousands of worlds. But be forewarned, beyond here, there will be spoilers. Are you ready for the adventure? Let's begin. And welcome back to the Stories Told podcast. I'm author E.W. Barnes, and with me is author Michael Grayford. And today we have the privilege of interviewing the author of the novel Don't Date the Haunted, Rae D'Arc. How are you doing today, Mike?
I'm doing fantastic, thanks.
And I'm also doing well. So we wanted to give Rae an opportunity to introduce herself and talk a little bit about her background and what brought her into the writing world. So we'll go ahead and hand the figurative mic over to her.
Hi, I am Rae D'Arc. I've been involved in every stage of a book's life. I am a writer, editor, retailer, reader, and reviewer. I once worked 4 part-times simultaneously, but thankfully one of them paid me. So I have my bachelor's in English from Brigham Young University, and I now live in the Tri-Cities of Washington with my husband and Aussie dog. And yes, to say my name, it's Rae D'Arc. You don't need to give yourself the hiccups to say my name.
So let me go ahead and read from the back of the book to describe this story. Don't Date the Haunted is a dark romantic comedy. And here is the synopsis from the back of the book. As a born and raised citizen of horror, Pansy Finster has survived hauntings such as mad killers and poltergeists by living her brother's rules, including avoid dolls, clowns, and masks. But after the death of her fiancé, Pansy finds herself alone, which is a dangerous status in horror. When she flees to Hartford Romance, she's startled that a masquerade has Regency ladies screaming in excitement. Culture shocked, Pansy struggles to avoid any ill omens, such as repeated glances from the curiously handsome Lord Theo from Fantasy. With a seemingly useless magical ability, he could be the romance Pansy never knew she needed, or her most deceitful haunting yet. Pansy must learn to love like a romantic and teach her new friends to survive like a horror before the masquerade becomes a massacre.
I just wanted to say, Rae, before we get started with this interview, I love this book. I love what you did with it. It was so much fun, and I really enjoyed it. So thank you for writing it. And now we'll get to the questions. Okay. What challenges did you have writing this story, and how did you resolve them?
One of the biggest challenges of writing Don't Date the Haunted was figuring out the genre of what kind of really how to market it, because it is it's not just a horror, it's not just a romance, it's not just comedy, it's all of the above. And then it also throws in characters from mystery and sci-fi, literally in fantasy. And so it was a lot of fun talking with editors, talking with other authors, trying to figure out exactly where to place it and how to focus it. Because the first couple drafts, actually, it was like the first half was all romance, and then the second half was all horror. Kind of like the Jurassic Park movie of like the first half it's beautiful and you're just learning about creating dinosaurs again. And then the second half, it all goes to the pits. So that's how it was originally, but that didn't really work for my readers so much. So I had to learn how to revise it in a way that to really blend the genres and have elements of romance all throughout and elements of horror all throughout, just like little snippets here and there, and also to also clean the horror up a little bit to focus it a little more on the romance. 5 people no longer die. And and I added an extra romantic scene to build that relationship and that genre to make it more of a romance, because initially I set out to write a horror and I ended up writing a romance. But I'm quite proud of how it is now. Like, I actually had to go chapter by chapter and make sure and add or take away to make sure that there was a little bit of horror element and a little bit of romance element in every single chapter, to try to smooth the transition and also to make sure that the readers were getting what they wanted.
And I think you did that.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I agree. I could see that being a rough challenge. Do you feel like you figured out how to market it?
A little bit. It's a lot easier to market in person, where I can tell people and explain, hey, this is what it's like. To say, it's kind of like Wednesday Addams goes to Austin Land, to be able to bring out those comparisons of, it's kind of like Tim Burton of the clean romance with a lot of dark humor, because people see dark romantic comedy, and it's not a common genre, and so they have questions, and it's really helpful for me to market it in person, to say, hey, yeah, this is what it's like, to expand on that a little more, because it's not a dark romance, it's not a dark comedy, it's not a romantic comedy, it's dark romantic comedy.
Yeah, I agree. I think that phrase nails it perfectly, actually.
I am not really a romance fan, and I'm not really a horror fan. But I found this delightful because of how brilliantly everything was woven together. And there is, and maybe this is not purposeful and I'm just reading into this, but there does seem to be a slightly tongue-in-cheek quality to this when all of the sort of horror story rules are laid out at the very beginning as part of a book of rules. Not in a cynical way, in a really fun way. And I think it really is wonderful. And I will tell you that I was talking to everybody about this book. So I really appreciated the characters, and I especially appreciated how the characters grew and developed but remained consistent with themselves. They were very well-defined, three-dimensional characters who were very enjoyable to read, very believable to read. What was your method for developing these characters in the story?
Well, with Pansy's roommates, I actually used some inspiration from my own roommates. I actually did have a roommate named Heather, and she's different, but she was very kind of a little more proper, a little more of a eager to get married, and and then I did also have a roommate named Brooke, who was just so much fun. And, that is her description of the wild red hair that I was always jealous of. and, and just the really fun layers of clothing that were kind of futuristic and kind of vintage. Like, those were her actual clothes. And so she definitely inspired me for that. But I did also combine another roommate, from another real life roommate into Brooke's character, to give her a little bit, not more well-rounded, but to just kind of give her some different definitions. For a lot of the other characters, like Emma and Tiffany, and especially Emma, and also with Heather, I wanted to take their stereotypes and then give them a little twist. So Emma is very much kind of the stereotypical, almost like Barbie character of the long blonde hair, just a little Well, okay. Tiffany is also a little of the Barbie character where she's just super overexcited and talking super fast and oh my gosh, it was just and then Emma, I wanted her to be the friend that or like kind of like the sister. You don't always get along, but you still love each other. And Heather, I wanted to give her that she's a Regency romantic, but she needed to have a little twist to explain why is she at this contemporary university. Regency women didn't go to university or colleges and so I wanted to give her a little bit more of a forward thinking mind to explain why she's there and to also help her have the desire to fit in with the contemporaries, but then still hold true to her own character that and her own morals, her own standards. And yeah, Pansy, the main character, her original inspiration was actually just the idea of the side character who continually survived. But just as the book developed, realized no, she is the main character. She is definitely, she knows what's going on. She knows how to survive a haunting, the land of horror. And with that comes knowledge of how to survive horror, of what the rules of horror are. And with that comes a little, a more than healthy dose of paranoia. Don't go into the dark by yourself and, never split up and don't make promises because they're either kept to an early grave or they're broken. And so she has these rules and just focusing on those rules was what really created her. And then Theodore is, at least appearance-wise, is based on my husband because I love him. So my husband is 6 foot and has blue-green eyes and dark brown hair, and so I based that on my husband, but then also having fun with the fact that and this is kind of spoiler, that he has a magical ability because he's from fantasy, but it's also considered useless. And my husband and I were actually reading Alcatraz versus the Evil Librarians before and around this time that I was creating this story. And I loved the idea of taking a seeming weakness of, the main character in that series. His ability is, or his magic power is to be able to break things. And it's seen as a huge hindrance, as a huge problem. But in that story, they make it this, it's his superpower. He's able to do amazing things with it. And I really wanted to do that with Theo's magical ability, to make it seem completely useless and that he is almost burdened and embarrassed by his ability, but then to be able to show, no, there's a purpose for this. There is a strength in this. And so I had a lot of fun figuring out what that ability was. I went through a couple different options of what his ability was and eventually landed on what it is now. I'm not saying it to avoid spoilers because I didn't actually figure it out until I wrote book 3 and what his ability entirely encompasses. But then I altered book 2 to show that, he figures out everything about his ability, or at least really develops his ability to its full capacity in book 2, so that you get that a little sooner, because that's in book 2 they go to fantasy. Book 1, Don't Date the Haunted. It's Pansy. She's from horror. It starts in horror, and you get to see her everyday life in horror, and playing a lot with the tropes and some of the little common themes of like all the numbers add up to 13, and kind of like the 1408 from Stephen King, and then she goes to romance in book 1. I get her there really quickly because that's where things really get going and we have fun with her culture shock. And so book 2, though, they go to fantasy, and she is culture shocked again, just thinking, what is with this place, specifically Grimm's fairy tale fantasy. And so, yeah, so she's, faced werewolves and serial killers, but she's never faced a giant, or in-laws. And
That's great.
so she gets, new experiences there, as book 2 actually focuses a lot on the significant other of book 1, as it's more his story as he develops a lot. Like I mentioned, he discovers his second ability, the full capabilities of his ability. And then in book 3 they go back to horror, where she knows what's going on, Pansy knows what's up, but the people she brings with her have magics that make them look like witches who need to be hunted and killed. So I had a lot of fun in book 3 switching it, where they become the hauntings in a way, as they go back to horror and have to try to, not scare everybody around them.
It's very clever how you have crafted each of these stories to take advantage of the sort of fish out of water theme.
Yes.
But it's a wonderful place to put your characters, because they stand in for the reader. And so then the reader gets the explanations that they need and they understand. I think it's very, very clever.
Thank you. I had a lot of fun with it.
I thought it was very clever to create this sense of culture shock in a setting of a university where you have people from all over, different places, different backgrounds. Naturally, they have different cultures, and being forced to live with each other and deal with each other. Like that rang very true to me from my experience in the university, where I think for a lot of us, it's like the first time you go to somewhere and there's just people from everywhere there that you may not have seen before. In our world, from India or China or Norway or Germany, wherever, all over the world. And then here, from the different genres, mapping that concept from these people all over the place to being people from different genres, I thought was brilliant. That was very clever.
Yeah, I did emulate it a lot off of my own experience at university, because even though I went to a private university where we were all the same religion, we still had very different ideas of how to study, how to live, how to, keep the house, or at least our little apartment, and how to, just etiquettes and different mannerisms, different ways that we grew up. And I've seen a few fun Facebook posts or just social media posts of, like, I didn't know, people saying I didn't know that this was weird until, of like, people mentioning things that they thought were completely normal in there because that was the way they grew up, until they went to college or university and realized, oh, nope. So I do feel like culture shock is something that everyone can relate to, at least at some point, some way in their lives, as long, whenever they interact with their friends or neighbors, of seeing, oh, there are different ways to live, and different ways to do something, and maybe my way isn't the best way. And just, looking at the paradigm shifts of when we see things in a new light, and the impact that has on us.
So I did have a follow-up question about your characters. Was there a character that was particularly difficult to craft for you?
I might say Mr. E, because he is, based on the, it's either Mr. E or Theo, because Theo does play such a prominent role, and, just trying to figure out why he was in romance and what his abilities were. That was difficult. But then Mr. E was difficult in a different way, because I knew all along that he would have an ambiguous name and just be teasing the main character along with that. And that he would be a mystery detective. He would be like kind of the noir detective of trying to figure out and poke and prod the main character about her ex-fiance and his death. The difficult part came with trying to figure out his voice, because in my head, everything he said sounded like a question. And so it kind of like even just regular phrases, it sounded like a question in my head. But I recognized that would not translate onto the page. And so I had to go through most of or all of his words, his dialogue, and try to rewrite them into questions to make his actual dialogue sound the way it sounded in my head. And that was not exactly easy to rephrase everything. And and not every single thing he says is a question, because some things just, don't exactly work that way. And then, yes, also figuring out his motives of why he was there, why he was pinpointing Pansy specifically. That was also kind of a tricky thing to figure out, but figured it out, eventually. That's how stories kind of tend to go. But like a lot of things, you have ideas of, or at least for me, I have ideas of what I want to happen, but not exactly knowing how to make them happen.
And yet it really worked. So you could tell that you spent the time on it.
I agree. I think the work that you spent on editing, revising, and polishing really shows.
I did. From start to publish, this book took me about 4 years. So at least the first book. And I did actually have all 3 books done, though, before I published the first book. Because even though the first book can stand alone, I had way too much fun with the story and the characters and the setting. So book 1 turned into a book 2, which almost turned into a 2.5 until I figured out book 2 and the many versions and drafts of that story. It was a lot of fun to figure out book 2 to make it work. When I had book 3, book 3 actually helped me really figure out book 2, and so that was one of the reasons why I waited, because as soon as I had book 3, I knew there would be a book 2. I just needed to make it fit with book 1 and 3. And so I had so book 2 was actually the huge struggle in making the trilogy work, and I waited until book 2 was drafted in a way that pleased me until I published book 1, because book 2 went through 4 different first drafts.
Yeah, I think the fun and the joy you had in this world and with these characters and writing the stories really comes through in the work.
Oh God, yeah. I've realized with these stories that if it doesn't make me laugh, I can't write it. I have to have fun with it. I tried writing a super serious story that will now never see the light of day because I can't write it. It's too serious.
That's funny. I think I'm the same way. Like I always want to have at least some humor in a story.
Well, and yeah, I've discovered that my favorite books to read have healthy doses of romance, suspense or thriller or action, and the third element of comedy or humor. So I try to include all 3 of those elements in all of my stories. But when reading a book, if it only has one of those elements, I can't finish it. I try. I really want to. A lot of the times, it's just hard for me. I'm a picky reader.
Hey, there's nothing wrong with that. You know, the things that you enjoy are what you like. So
yes.
Read that. So what was your favorite part of writing this story?
The culture clashes, for the most part, of letting her attend college university and go through some of the same experiences that I did with my roommates, of like the roommate deal with the if they hold hands with the guy, then they owe their roommates chocolate, and if they the first kisses, then they owe their roommates cake. Yeah, and then if they get engaged, then they owe their roommates a dinner. And I actually had that deal with my roommates, which was great because I didn't date a lot. And my roommates did. But I did change it a little. Like with my roommates, it was ice cream and pizza. for pizza was for making out, but I changed it a little to make it more set for the romance of the, having cake and chocolate. I think with my roommates it was just candy in general, but chocolate is very much a romance food and cake is very much a romance food. And with my roommates we had ice cream, but that's kind of like a breakup food. So I had a lot of fun just including some of my own experiences and, of course, twisting them a little bit to play with the setting and the characters involved. And yeah, to really explore culture clashes of experiencing life in a new way, seeing the world in new light, and considering ways that we can change or adapt and grow from seeing different ways of life that our way is not always the best way and we can learn from each other. I love that concept. I have culture clashes in all of my books because not only is it a great way to introduce the characters and their past and the setting that they're in, but also because it fascinates me to explore other cultures and to learn from them.
That's really smart. I like that. I love the concept for this book in general, how different genres are different lands, and you have characters from each of those, and represent their lands so well and their genre so well. I thought it was very clever, very fun, and the story, like in the horror aspect of it, it kind of reminds me of like some quirky horror stories where it takes the genre and twists it like a Scream or something like that. But it's also clearly a romance story, and you blend those together so well. The goal you set out to meet, you actually succeeded quite well at it.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times when people blend horror and romance, it turns into a dark romance of like the paranormal romances, and I did not want that for this story. My paranormals are for killing, not for dating, and that was actually, the phrase that helped spur the title, or that helped inspire this title of "Don't Date the Haunted." To say, yeah, these hauntings are not for dating; they are for killing.
I love how she sees everything through her lens of the horror world, right? Of the haunted world that she comes from. She's like, she couldn't picture going to the masquerade ball without there being a mass murder.
Love that.
Such a great line and a great insight into her, all the little sayings that she has and that comes from the book. Don't film yourself sleeping. Never own a record player. It's so good.
I had a lot of fun with her roommate Heather unpacking her dolls, and I'm sorry if you hear my dog growling. So yeah, when Heather unpacks her dolls, though, which is a huge no-no in horror, of like, nope, those things are possessed, they are creepy, and of course Heather thinks, oh no, they're my prized possessions from my great grandmother Eyre, from little joke of throw in for Jane Eyre, just to dolls. They're just historical ornamented figurines in Heather's opinion.
Yeah.
So yeah, playing with not just horror versus contemporary or Regency romance, but also horror versus fantasy in book 2, where people they burst out into song when she arrives. Like, that's just how they greet people. And she's completely bewildered and doesn't really know how to react to a lot of what happens in fantasy.
So what was your favorite part of the story, Mike?
Ooh, my favorite part. I don't know. There's so much I liked in there. I think, let me think about this. Probably the ending. I like the way it came together. Are we going to give away spoilers here if I talk about what happens? Keep it somewhat general in the way that characters from previous life come back into the story in a surprising way. I thought that worked really well. I always like it, and at the end how if a story's got these different aspects to it, things come together in a surprising way and blend to create a solution, right? Where more people have to solve the crisis of the story than just the protagonist. I thought that you did this really well in this story, Rae. I thought that having the characters come together, and like you said, you brought in some of the themes that you were talking about with characters having different ideas, right? It's like maybe this one way to do things that the protagonist had doesn't work in this case. And you have to be open to different ideas and different possible solutions. I think that came together really well for me. What about you? What was your favorite part?
Two things stand out for me in the story. One was how clever the culture shock was. And it was not just our main character, but we had like you pointed out, Brooke was new to romance, and you had the fantasy guy who was coming in from a different world into romance. And even Heather, Regency romance is different than contemporary romance. And I just loved all the layers of the culture shock that were built in throughout. And it was such a delight to read that. The other thing I really appreciated was how you deftly and carefully dealt with the issue of grief. You know, we have a young woman here who has lost her fiancé. I'm a human being who has lost her fiancé. And so I thought you handled that really, really well, in that you need to start again, you need to start over, but you can't forget what's going on there. You need to process what's going on there. And I thought it was just handled beautifully. And as Mike pointed out, the end wrapped up that thread elegantly as well.
How did you come up with the name Don't Date the Haunted?
So for the first 4 years of writing it and drafting it and working on it, it was simply called Haunted Romance, because as like a placeholder, and unfortunately it became like I didn't think of another title for the whole of that time. And it was almost difficult for me to switch in my head of like, no, it's called Don't Date the Haunted now. But I did keep the Haunted Romance as the series or the trilogy title. So it's the Haunted Romance trilogy. But when trying to figure out the cover, I was going back and forth with my cover artist, whom I love her. I will happily promote her stuff. And just, she was in my writing group before it fizzled out from COVID. But, you know, we were talking different ways of how to convey the romance, the comedy, and the horror elements, all within a picture and all within a title of, 6 words or less. And I went through a lot of different like little iterations, didn't love any of them, but one of my best friends actually from college, who is not represented but definitely acknowledged in the acknowledgments, she helped me come up with the name Don't Date the Haunted, kind of as a rule from Oz's book, and yet also because book 2 is Don't Marry the Cursed, and then book 3 is Don't Dance with Death. So they're all kind of like, little rules from Oz, but then not something that he mentioned. And I did actually, because fans requested it, make Oz's book as a tangible pocketbook for people to carry around. And I mentioned that, Pansy publishes it after book 2. And so she adds her own notes into Oz's book. And, one of the sections in the back is how to avoid a haunted romance. Don't meet in horror, don't date the haunted, don't marry the cursed, don't dance with death, don't start a relationship when you're involved in a haunting, and if you think it's true love at first sight, suspect trickery. So, it's just her little notes in a different font from Oz's original notes, and it's a ridiculous thing to print, so I mostly give it away as a free gift when people buy the whole trilogy, but it is available on Barnes & Noble because they were the only ones who would print something small enough.
That was such a fun interview. I really enjoyed having Rae on our show.
Yeah, I agree. And a great first interview for us to do, I think.
I agree. And a great story to be able to read for this interview. I'm really excited about that.
Yeah. I mean, I was going to say the same thing. It's like it's good to start off with a great book that's fun to read and have someone to interview who's excited about her work and loves talking about it and has so much to say, so much to fill us in on. I thought it went great.
So one of the things that we generally talk about when we're looking at the stories told in all of the entertainment that we're consuming is what our takeaways are as a writer. So I'm curious as to what your takeaway is from the story told in Don't Date the Haunted.
I mean, there's a lot. You know, all the things that we've talked about and that Rae mentioned over the interview, I think are good things. Certainly the amount of thought that she put into the book really shines through. For me, I'd say probably the biggest takeaway for this book in particular, and the uniqueness of it, is the blending of genres and how that was done so well. Typically, there's like one genre, right? And then you may have some subgenres in there. You might have mystery with a little bit of a horror element, something like that. Or you have a fantasy story with, you know, a heist going on, but it's primarily like in the fantasy world. This seemed like almost an even blend between the two. It's really clever. I'll have to think about that and see if I can incorporate other genre elements in a more pronounced way into my work. Because I tend to focus more on, it's either fantasy or it's sci-fi. I kind of put action adventure in all of my works, but it would be nice to try to blend something a little bit more into it. I think it adds a lot of depth to the story and a lot of you can play with a lot of interesting tropes and blend between the two. Yeah. What about you? What is your big takeaway?
Well, before I go to my takeaway, I wanted to reflect on what you just said a little bit, because one of the things that I remember thinking as I was reading this was how knowledgeable Rae is about all of these genres. Because you have to know the genres well to be able to replicate them as well as they were replicated in this book. It is not a surface understanding. It is a deep
true.
understanding of the elements of these genres to be able to weave them in so well. And I think that's reflected in how well it works.
Especially in the horror genre, because I know that one more. I'm surprised at how many little tropes and things that you see repeated throughout the horror stories that there are. It's like she found like every one of them. It seemed like it was great. And the romance as well. It's like I have a vague understanding of romance, mostly just from like watching romantic comedies. You see a lot of the beats that occur, and she was playing off of those as well. Yeah.
So what my takeaway is there is a love for this story that comes out clearly in the writing. When an author loves their story, it just makes the story shine. And so my takeaway is to write what I love and really focus on that. And I know that, there's some people who, talk about, writing to market and writing what will sell. But I think there's a way to do both. Write what people want to read, but also write what you love. And so that's my takeaway from this, is just make sure I love my stories. And that will come through in my writing.
Oh man, that is such a good point. I try to do that. I think it will be hard for me to expand into a area that I'm not as interested in, because the last book that I wrote, which isn't out yet, it's still in editing phase. As I was writing it, I was having such a good time writing it, and I was thinking, I don't know if anyone else is going to enjoy this story, but at least it entertains me. So yeah, hopefully you can find that sweet spot where you're doing that, and you find a way to get it to people who will also like it. All right, what is your last word on this?
It's a great book.
I agree.
People need to read it. I have my hard copy, my paperback right here that I'm going to turn around and hand off to friends, because that's what happens. And I am going to be texting the audiobook link to my audiobook friends who asked for it. And we thank you for joining us as we talked about the story told in Don't Date the Haunted. And a big thank you to Rae D'Arc for joining us and allowing us to talk today about her great book. And we will put a link to both the reading versions and the audio versions in the show notes. A big thank you also to our Patreon supporters and all our subscribers. We are so grateful for your support and your encouragement. The Stories Told podcast is available on multiple podcast platforms, and we thank you for liking and subscribing or following, depending on where you're listening. It may not be a big deal to you, but it means a lot to us. You can find Michael Grayford at michaelgrayford.com and E.W. Barnes at 1000years.com, and those links are in the show notes. Join us next time as we discuss the story told in episode 2 of season 2 of Loki. Thank you so much, Mike. This was a lot of fun.
I agree. It was a good interview, fun talk. I'm looking forward to next week as well.
And we'll see you next time on the Stories Told podcast.